Hi, I'm Emily Parker. My parents forgot my birthday again. No texts, no calls, nothing. So the next morning, I showed up at their house in my brand new Porsche. They acted surprised, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Ever had your family completely underestimate you? Share your story in the comments. The kitchen smelled like burnt toast, and the coffee was barely warm when I opened my laptop to check emails. My birthday notifications blinked at the top. 1, 2, 3 unread messages I had sent to my parents. Nothing. No reply, no happy birthday, not even a thumbs up emoji. Shrugging, I tapped out another text, then tossed my phone onto the counter, figuring it was the usual pattern. Breakfast was quick. I chopped a few strawberries, poured cereal into a bowl, and sipped coffee that had gone tepid while scrolling through the emails again. My mother had sent a forward of a recipe she loved 2 weeks ago, but nothing acknowledging today. My father hadn't replied to any of my texts in days. Typical, I told myself. I shoved the last spoonful of cereal down and grabbed my tote bag, patting the leather that held the contract for my app sale, just barely visible through the zipper. Garage doors slid up with the press of a button, and the new Porsche gleamed under the morning sun. The engine purred, low and smooth, and I let it run for a moment, enjoying the sound, letting the neighbors glance over in passing. A smirk crossed my face. "Guess my birthday isn't the only thing you forgot," I muttered, tapping the horn lightly. Pulling up to my parents' house, I noticed the security camera flicker briefly, just a second or two of black, but the motion sensor didn't alert anyone. Lucky coincidence? Or maybe something else. Either way, I pushed it out of my mind and parked. The garage door clanged behind me as it closed, and I stepped onto the concrete, feeling the weight of the day already pressing. Inside, Linda and Richard were at the table. Linda's fork hovered midair, eyes darting up to glance at the car, her lips curling into a forced smile. Richard scrolled through his phone without a glance in my direction. "Happy birthday to me. Guess you forgot again," I said, letting the words hang. "Oh, hey, look at the car!" Linda's voice was too high, too casual, like she was auditioning for a part she didn't want. Richard's brow furrowed, his lips pressed together in silence. He didn't say a word, just tilted his head as if trying to read something invisible on the counter. I set my bag down slowly, letting the zipper glint in the light. The contract inside caught just a glimpse of the morning sun. No rush to show it yet. Patience was part of the plan. My watch buzzed with pending notifications, the birthday text still unread. "Who bought you that?" Linda asked before I could open my mouth. Her voice carried that thin veneer of excitement, but it trembled with something else. Suspicion, maybe, or curiosity veiled as civility. Richard leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing at the screen of my phone. I didn't flinch. He wasn't seeing the truth yet, only the surface. I pressed the remote to open the garage fully before coming in, the engine's low hum echoing against the walls. The sound drew a glance or two from the neighbors outside, some heads peeking from windows. "Guess my birthday isn't the only thing you forgot," I added again, letting the words slide off my tongue, sharper this time. A little black humor, a pinch of irony. It wasn't a joke, just a reminder of the gap between what they assumed and what had actually happened. Linda shuffled papers on the table, glancing at the contract that had been casually left open, the figures peeking out just enough to draw attention. Richard's fingers hovered over the phone screen, then retreated. I stepped fully into the house, heels clicking lightly against the hardwood. The air stiffened immediately. "So, where did the money come from?" Linda asked, voice low now, a tinge of accusation slipping through. Richard didn't speak. He just looked, lips pursed, calculating. The tension thickened, wrapping around the room like a slow-moving storm. My arrival had done its work. The Porsche was just a prop. The real weight was the quiet, piercing realization settling across the table. And I knew then that this birthday was nothing like the others. The drive back to my apartment felt longer than it actually was. The Porsche hummed steadily beneath me, but the quiet was heavy, filled with all the looks and half-smiles from my parents. Neighbors who caught a glimpse of the car had already formed their assumptions. Inside the vehicle, my phone buzzed. Marcus texting as usual. "Don't fight with feelings, gather proof first," he wrote. I tapped back a quick thumbs up. Practical advice, but it stung in its own way. People already assumed I was showing off, and now Marcus, who had watched most of my hard work unfold, reminded me that perception mattered as much as reality. The house felt small behind me, suffocating, even from the driver's seat. Emails pinged again, no responses from anyone I expected. My parents were already spinning narratives among themselves, I could tell. Linda, I imagined, was briefing the younger siblings, quietly warning them about my ego trip. Richard, in his usual meticulous way, was probably double-checking accounts, ensuring nothing slipped past. The thought of them strategizing while I sat in a car that represented years of effort made a bitter taste rise in my mouth. At the apartment, I tossed my bag onto the counter, letting the zipper fall just enough to hint at the contract inside. The deal was finalized, waiting for me to unpack it, but today wasn't about celebration. The camera at my parents' house flickered out just for a second yesterday. The timing had been perfect. Not an accident, I decided. That little glitch had been enough to make me pause, enough to know someone was trying to control the narrative, even remotely. Marcus called just as I set the bag down. "You ready for tonight?" he asked. "I guess, as ready as I can be," I said, leaning against the counter. "The family meeting is a deadline. Don't forget it," he reminded. I sighed. There it was, the first real marker of pressure. My stomach twisted at the thought of walking into a room where my parents already had their scripts written. Later, I went through my bag again. The contract sat neatly folded, still unopened. The numbers, my months of coding, pitching, and networking, stared back at me in tiny print. Not a thing I had done casually, not random. I touched the edge and said softly, "I didn't stay quiet for no reason." The message tone buzzed again. Marcus. "This family drama should be streamed," he wrote. I chuckled, even if it was sharp and dry, letting a little black humor ease the pressure. It wasn't funny, not really, but saying it out loud helped me keep my head. Dinner time crept up faster than expected. The table would be crowded, voices low, glances sharp. Every movement from Linda and Richard was going to carry a silent warning or accusation. I rehearsed nothing. Every sentence would have to be steady, deliberate. My phone buzzed again, Marcus sending a last-minute reminder. "Meet them prepared, evidence only, emotions don't get points." I slipped the phone into my pocket. Preparations done, I stepped into the hallway, checking my reflection in the mirror. Nothing extravagant, just neat, professional, capable. That would be enough, or at least I hoped. When I arrived, Linda's gaze flitted up at me immediately. "Emily, sit down," she said, tone sweet but firm, the kind that signals rules are already set. Richard followed, his hands folded on the table, eyes scanning for inconsistencies, questions, anything that might give him control. "Who bought the car?" Linda asked before any pleasantries. Her eyes were sharp, but her voice attempted civility, failing miserably. The younger siblings watched, smirks hidden behind raised eyebrows. Richard didn't speak, but the look he gave me said everything. The room felt crowded, the air thick with expectation. Every glance and word from them was a test, a probe, a challenge. I placed my bag on the chair next to me, letting the zipper glint slightly in the light. The contract inside was a silent witness, ready to tell a story they didn't expect to hear. Linda reached for my phone, a casual touch that was anything but. "You're not lying to us, are you?" she said, just enough to make the words sting. "Not at all," I replied smoothly. A faint smirk curled the edge of my lips, black humor lurking. This was about to get very interesting. Back at my apartment, pulling out emails and old messages, scrolling through 2 years of conversations I hadn't thought to check in a while. One subject line caught my attention immediately. Investment proposal, Emily's app. My fingers hesitated over it for a second before opening, revealing the pitch I had sent my parents long ago. Screenshots of financial logs and the draft projections I'd painstakingly created all stared back. Every figure was precise, every note annotated. They'd laughed at me back then, dismissed it as a dream, but now the same numbers were no longer invisible. The camera glitch from my parents' house popped into my mind, the brief flicker, the blackout that had lasted just long enough to raise a question. It hadn't been a coincidence. Someone had intentionally interfered, creating a blind spot at the exact moment I needed to step into the house. It clicked. That little anomaly wasn't random. Linda and Richard had been setting the stage for control, manipulating access without a word. The next morning, I pulled the contract from my bag before stepping inside their kitchen. The familiar hum of the Porsche engine lingered as I carried it, feeling the weight not of paper, but of proof. Linda's eyes widened slightly, but she masked it with a polite nod. Richard's gaze flicked briefly toward me, narrowed, measuring the situation, calculating his response. "Who helped you?" Linda asked first, tone attempting casualness but thick with skepticism. "No one," I replied evenly. "It's mine." Her laugh was short and sharp, barely a chuckle. "Sure, you earned all that on your own?" I set the contract on the table, letting the corners peek open so she could see the top line of numbers. 6 figures, bold and undeniable. "Yes, every cent," I said. Richard leaned forward, brow furrowed. "That's not possible," he murmured, shaking his head. He tried to dismiss it, to reduce the numbers, but the evidence was already in front of him. The way he pressed his lips together betrayed the frustration he couldn't voice. Linda picked up the papers, flipping through them slowly, as if the act of touching them could somehow diminish their value. She paused, glanced at me, eyes skeptical but also calculating. Her fingers lingered over the figures, attempting to find a flaw that wasn't there. "Remember when you laughed at my idea?" I said, voice calm, almost conversational, though the edge was unmistakable. No drama, just a statement that left them with the weight of their own disbelief. She froze, mid-flip, and Richard glanced at her, realization dawning in that slow, deliberate way that made everything in the room tense. They had underestimated the seriousness, the precision, and the patience involved. I let the contract rest on the table, corners jutting slightly, an obvious display of what I had accomplished without needing validation. "Glad I didn't ask you to co-sign a loan," I added under my breath, smirking. Black humor, just sharp enough to remind them I wasn't playing a family game. It wasn't meant to amuse, only to mark the gap between their assumptions and reality. Linda's hand moved to her phone. She dialed a number quickly, her voice neutral but insistent. Yes, I need to confirm this," she said, keeping her eyes on the papers, as if the act of calling reinforced her authority. I didn't know who she was reaching, probably someone she trusted to reinforce her version of the truth, but it didn't matter. The first ripple of external pressure had begun, threading through the room, threading through me. I straightened slightly, letting the energy of the moment settle over the table. The contract sat there like a challenge, a tangible thing that couldn't be ignored, smudged only by their disbelief and the faint hope they could downplay it. Richard muttered something under his breath, too low for me to catch, a protest in the form of muttering that didn't change a thing. Linda's phone call ended, but the tension remained, thick enough to choke the air. Every glance they exchanged now carried the acknowledgement. The situation wasn't going to bend in their favor, not today. I sat at my desk, scanning the latest alerts from my bank account, when a red flag appeared. Access denied. Not an error, not a glitch. Richard had restricted my permissions, locked me out of accounts I had controlled for years. My stomach sank. This was more than suspicion now. It was action. Linda was busy across the table, rifling through older investment documents. She held one of my signed contracts, turning it over, as if rolling it in her hands could somehow erase its validity. A canceled stamp suddenly appeared on the page. She had marked it herself, or at least it looked official. My pulse picked up, my mind ticking through the possibilities. That little camera blackout from the first day flashed through my head again. Not a coincidence. That brief loss of footage had been deliberate, a setup to test boundaries. Marcus texted, as usual, "Keep calm, gather proof, don't let them rattle you." His tone was practical, neutral. He wasn't here to intervene, just to remind me that control over evidence was my only leverage. The phone buzzed again. Richard's name appeared on the caller ID. I answered cautiously. "You need to sign the documents immediately," he said, voice measured but firm, "or there will be consequences regarding your ownership." I leaned back, letting the words settle. Ownership. Control. The stakes had shifted into tangible territory. This wasn't a conversation about trust anymore. This was about rights, paperwork, and legal strings. I checked the automated emails from the bank and noticed a minor change in the text of the notification about account access. Small, almost unnoticeable, but enough to indicate manipulation. They were adjusting the digital record to exert authority, to make it appear as if I hadn't been diligent. Linda picked up a stamp from the table, pressing it onto another contract with deliberate precision. The ink smeared slightly, yet it carried weight, authority, even though the action screamed questionable. I studied it, noting the irregularities, already thinking about how I could prove it wasn't genuine. Every glance they shared was calculated. Every word that passed between them was designed to unsettle me. Their combined force, the subtle manipulation, the network of allies they had likely spoken to, made the walls feel closer than ever. The room was heavy with implication, not noise. I tapped at my laptop, accessing files I had mirrored on an external drive. Every document, every email, every bank log. My defenses were digital now, and the physical papers in their hands were only a distraction from the bigger picture. If they wanted to test me, they'd have to contend with what I already controlled. The doorbell rang faintly, the timing coinciding with my assessment of the contracts. I ignored it. Outside, the world continued. Inside, every movement, every subtle gesture mattered. Richard's voice broke the focus again, asking for confirmation from a lawyer on his end. "This is non-negotiable. Sign or you lose rights." I shifted the contract slightly, keeping my hands in motion so they couldn't read the entire contents at a glance. It was a small tactic, but I had learned over time that details made the difference. Linda noticed, raising an eyebrow, but she didn't say anything. That hesitation was leverage. Marcus pinged again. "Check the timestamps. Look for inconsistencies. Keep calm." His advice threaded through my thoughts as I cross-referenced every digital record with the printed versions. Each discrepancy reinforced the pattern I had already suspected. Deliberate interference, an attempt to limit my control. The more I reviewed, the clearer it became that I was being systematically boxed in. Accounts locked, contracts contested, communications intercepted. The network they had built, siblings, legal advisors, subtle coercion, was designed to create compliance without confrontation. I moved to open the cabinet where I kept duplicates of critical documents. My fingers brushed the edges of sealed envelopes and folders, each containing evidence, notarized confirmations, and backups. The room's energy shifted with every small action I took, signaling that I was aware, alert, and ready to counter. Linda's hand hovered over a folder I had left slightly exposed. She was about to make another mark when I stepped closer, casually placing my palm over the top of the papers. "Not yet," I said, tone neutral. The statement was small, but it set a boundary. Richard's phone rang again, likely calling their lawyer or a family associate. He spoke for a moment, glancing toward me, his eyes narrow. The pressure in the room was undeniable. My temporary loss of access, the frozen accounts, the manipulated paperwork, all of it was real, immediate, and visible. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every small sound seem louder. Papers rustled as I spread them across the table. Contracts, emails, bank logs, screenshots from 2 years ago. Each document reminded me of the trust I had placed in my family, trust that had been ignored, questioned, or outright sabotaged. The betrayal wasn't dramatic in a cinematic way, but it hit deep. I had believed in them, in the idea that family support was automatic, that their skepticism was temporary. I was wrong. My access to the accounts had been limited, critical permissions revoked. The contracts I had relied on for validation were in question. The sense of being isolated didn't come from loneliness exactly, but from the understanding that the people who should have been my allies were actively working against me. Every line in those emails, every minor alteration in the bank logs, suggested deliberate interference. Marcus's text popped up. "Have you confirmed the timestamps? Any irregularities?" He wasn't there to fix things for me. His role was clear: observe, advise, push me to prepare evidence. I checked the timestamps again, cross-referencing emails with call logs and previous entries in my spreadsheets. The small inconsistencies weren't mistakes, they were patterns. I went through the old messages, searching for one specific thread where Linda had casually dismissed my proposal. The text was short, almost a joke in her tone, but the implication had been clear. My idea was ridiculous. The memory stung, but now it served as proof. I noted it, highlighted the passage, and made a copy for the binder I was assembling. Contracts and emails were stacked, annotated, sorted by relevance and date. Each document represented a fraction of the work I had put into my application, the months of coding, pitching, refining, negotiating. My goal was no longer to convince my parents that I had succeeded. It was to create a verifiable record, a chain of evidence that could stand alone, without emotion, without argument. I reached for the phone, scrolling through contact lists until I found the names of people who could verify past conversations. Calls, video meetings, even casual chats where they had been present while my parents made dismissive remarks. I began sending messages, keeping each brief, professional, and focused on confirming facts: dates, times, content. One by one, responses trickled in, confirming what I already suspected. Checking bank logs again, I noticed minor corrections in entries from months ago, adjustments I hadn't caught at the time. Small manipulations, likely intended to create doubt or confusion, but now they were critical pieces in the puzzle. I exported every record, labeled them carefully, cross-checked against emails, contracts, and notes. The data formed a lattice of proof. Every action I took was measured, deliberate. The apartment felt crowded with paper, yet organized in a way that allowed me to anticipate questions before they were asked. Marcus texted once more. "Everything verifiable, no assumptions. Keep it factual." I tapped a reply, acknowledging the reminder. Emotion didn't solve this, clarity did. Time passed with a slow intensity. I paused occasionally, adjusting papers, making sure everything aligned. Each adjustment brought a sense of incremental control over the chaos my parents had created. The contracts, messages, and logs weren't just records. They were shields and weapons combined, evidence that demanded recognition. I checked the spreadsheet with projected timelines for signing and financial transfers. The company's deadlines loomed large, pressing me to act efficiently. One misstep could allow Linda or Richard to push the narrative in their favor. I made notes, organized folders, prioritized which evidence would be most compelling in different scenarios. Calls to witnesses were short and to the point. Dates, facts, verification. No emotional embellishment, no commentary on their disbelief. Each confirmation reinforced the clarity of the story I was assembling. The more I confirmed, the more the pattern of interference became visible, the more deliberate their actions appeared. As I gathered the last set of documents, I stacked them neatly, ready to transport. Contracts, emails, screenshots, call logs, all sorted and cross-referenced. The evidence wasn't abstract, it was tangible, a record that could withstand scrutiny, impartial and precise. The first email appeared just after noon. From the family lawyer, subject line sharp and unyielding. Immediate action required. I opened it slowly, scanning the words. A formal warning about deadlines, consequences for noncompliance, and repeated references to ownership rights. The tone was neutral, but the weight was anything but. My parents weren't just acting on suspicion, they had built an entire network to control the narrative. The implications hit me as I cross-referenced details from the past weeks. The blackout in the security camera on my parents' property, the one I had noticed the first morning, hadn't been random. Someone had orchestrated the precise timing to create a gap, to manipulate access, to put me in a vulnerable position. Every movement I had made under that brief cover had been anticipated. I glanced at the contract from my app sale. The numbers, the documentation, even the arrangement on the page, all of it had been viewed before by my parents. Their scrutiny was deliberate, designed to seed doubt. The files I thought were solely mine had already been under a critical eye, and the questions they raised weren't born from chance. The phone buzzed again. Marcus's text came through, calm and direct. Double-check the sources. Make sure everything is verifiable. He wasn't here to intervene physically, only to remind me that evidence, not argument, was my defense. I nodded to myself. Precision mattered now more than emotion. Minutes later, an incoming call displayed on my laptop, the family lawyer. Richard's voice came through, measured and deliberate. "Emily, you need to comply immediately. Sign the documents or your ownership will be challenged." I read the words twice, then 3 times, noting the legal language, the implied threat, the silent force behind them. Compliance wasn't optional. The documents weren't just forms. They were instruments of leverage, crafted to trap me into a position of dependence. Meanwhile, Linda had begun contacting people I had counted as witnesses. I could see the results in real time. Emails forwarding questions, subtle shifts in their responses, uncertainty creeping in where I had previously secured confirmation. The chain I had built to verify my actions and claims was being undermined, the narrative manipulated. I accessed the banking records again. Months of transactions now showed alterations, small adjustments to transfer dates and amounts, just enough to raise suspicion, just enough to give my parents a tactical advantage. The changes were minor, not catastrophic alone, but cumulatively, they rewrote the timeline I had relied upon. I organized my documents meticulously. Each contract, each screenshot, each bank log, each message thread. Everything had to be cross-referenced and ready. Any gap could be exploited. The network my parents had established was impressive. Siblings aligned, legal counsel engaged, indirect pressure applied to witnesses. They had orchestrated this over years, laying groundwork I hadn't recognized until now. Marcus sent a follow-up. Pay attention to the deadlines. Don't get caught reacting. Anticipate. His words reinforced what I already understood. The battle was no longer about proving capability or ambition. It was about survival within a system designed to restrain me. I reviewed a particularly tricky exchange, a minor discrepancy in an old email they had flagged. The evidence suggested my parents had previously seen the contract draft, deliberately left ambiguous to challenge my credibility. It wasn't an error. It was a controlled exposure. I marked the notes, highlighted dates, and documented context. Linda's phone buzzed again. Her conversation with one of my supposed witnesses was brief, her words measured. She didn't ask about the project itself, but about my credibility, subtly influencing the witness to second-guess earlier confirmations. The manipulation was methodical, precise, and intentionally hidden from me until it unfolded. The pressure wasn't theoretical anymore. My access limitations, altered transaction records, and shifting witness statements meant that every decision I made could carry immediate consequences. I double-checked every digital and physical record, comparing metadata, timestamps, and original files. Even a single misalignment could be used against me. Minutes dragged, each notification and message a potential hazard. I realized the scope of their control extended beyond the house, beyond the immediate family, and into networks I had assumed neutral. The game had shifted, and I was reacting to moves I hadn't anticipated when I began collecting evidence. I moved to a clean section of the table, laying out contracts, bank logs, and email printouts. Every item had to be immediately accessible, cross-referenced, and defensible. The pattern was clear. My parents had been constructing this leverage for years, integrating legal counsel, family alliances, and subtle manipulations. Richard's call ended, leaving silence that carried as much weight as the conversation itself. Linda's glance toward the documents suggested calculation. They weren't panicking, they were steering. Their strategy relied on creating pressure, isolating me, and destabilizing my foundation. I checked the bank interface again. Certain transactions had been flagged and altered, yet digital fingerprints remained. I noted the discrepancies, knowing they were traps, but also recognizing they could serve as proof if handled correctly. Each irregularity reinforced the fact that I wasn't merely reacting. I needed to reconstruct the sequence, anticipate each move, and prepare my counter. The room was set. I placed the stack of contracts and emails neatly on the conference table, arranging screenshots and bank logs so that every detail was visible. Marcus leaned against the far wall, observing silently, giving me a nod that said he knew what I was about to do. The lawyer from the previous emails was seated at the end of the table, pen poised, eyes scanning the documents I had prepared. This wasn't about confrontation, yet. It was about control, presenting undeniable proof at the right moment. Linda sat across from me, fidgeting with a pen, attempting casual conversation, but her gaze kept flicking toward the contracts. Richard's expression was tighter, lips pressed together as he tried to calculate my next move. I left the contract open slightly, making sure the 6-figure numbers and annotations were clear. "Remember when you laughed at my idea?" I said, placing my palm on the top of the documents, voice calm and deliberate. The tone was cold, without inflection, but it carried weight. The words hung in the air as eyes followed the motion of my hand on the papers. Linda's laugh was clipped, nervous. "That was years ago," she said, brushing her hair back as if to dismiss the past entirely. I shifted a folder slightly, revealing annotated emails and call logs, each one meticulously labeled, each timestamp verified. "Seems like it's still relevant," I added, voice even, letting the evidence speak louder than any argument. Richard leaned forward, pointing at a page. These could be fabricated," he said. His tone tried to assert authority, but the certainty in my presentation left him faltering. Marcus let out a short, dry chuckle from across the room, barely audible, but sharp enough to slice through the tension. His observation wasn't meant to amuse me. It was a reminder, a little black humor against the absurdity of their denial, the irony of power shifting in real time. I glanced at him briefly, a smirk forming that mirrored his sentiment. I reached for my laptop and pulled up a series of verified logs. The screen mirrored what was printed, showing clear, unalterable records. Each entry, each timestamp, each email was authenticated. "Everything here is verified," I said, dragging attention to the source files. Linda's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the papers, but I held them lightly in place. The stack was mine, the presentation under my control. Her eyes flicked to the lawyer, hoping for validation, for intervention. The lawyer remained neutral, pen hovering, but ready to act as witness to the evidence I laid out. Richard muttered under his breath, trying to conjure objections, pointing at small details, attempting to distract from the broader pattern. I countered each one, referencing timestamps, screenshots, and notarized documents. His attempts faltered as my organization and preparation left no room for ambiguity. I tapped a folder to reveal a voice recording from a previous call, one where Linda had dismissed the project as unrealistic. The audio played through the speaker, clear and uninterrupted. She flinched, caught by her own words. I watched her struggle to reconcile the reality in the recording with the narrative she had been asserting. Marcus leaned slightly forward, eyes following the reaction, almost wryly. His presence reminded me that the subtle humor of watching them unravel was part of the process, a measured release of tension in a room brimming with confrontation. The black humor wasn't laughter. It was recognition of justice quietly unfolding. I laid another folder down, this one with banking logs showing prior manipulations, all verified and cross-checked. Richard's eyes widened slightly, lips pressed in a thin line, trying to cover his surprise. The evidence now outstripped their ability to deny. Every alteration, every adjustment, every attempt at control was exposed. Linda's voice shook as she asked, How did you—" But she didn't finish. She realized too late that the manipulation she had orchestrated for years now lay bare on the table, undeniable. I let the documents remain undisturbed while the lawyer made a note of each item. The process was procedural, calm, but every tick of verification emphasized the loss of their control. The confrontation wasn't dramatic in flair. It was precise, surgical in its effectiveness. Richard pressed his palms to the table, leaning in, the tension in his shoulders obvious. "This doesn't make sense," he said, though the proof was absolute. I adjusted the folder again, making sure the annotations were visible. "It makes perfect sense if you remember who laughed first," I replied, tone steady, almost conversational, letting the records speak the truth. Linda's face reddened, a flush of exposure creeping across her features. Richard's jaw tightened, his fingers tapping the table, a subtle display of frustration and helplessness. The balance had shifted. The room had recalibrated, and I was firmly in the position of authority. The final email from a witness appeared on the laptop, confirming the dates and details, leaving no room for argument. My parents' network of influence, the years of preparation, the subtle manipulations, they were all exposed in front of the lawyer, in front of me. I slid the folder of contracts and bank records into the top drawer of my new desk, pressing it closed with a click that felt like a small punctuation to months of maneuvering. Every paper, every annotated email, every screenshot of altered transactions now lay sealed and secured. The weight of the work wasn't just in its documentation. It was in the finality it represented. No more interference, no more manipulation. Outside, the Porsche waited, polished, humming softly under the winter sun. I ran my hand along the hood, then slid into the driver's seat. The engine responded immediately, a low purr that reminded me of the distance I had crossed from tension to control. Across the driveway, through the wide glass windows of my parents' house, I could see Linda and Richard standing there. Their faces were still, their posture rigid. The realization had finally reached them. They no longer had authority over my decisions, my finances, or my life. The road ahead was clear, but I lingered a moment, letting them observe the calm I carried. Linda's mouth opened, then closed. Richard's hands dropped slowly to his sides. They didn't move, speak, or gesture. Their silence was heavy, a mirror to their missed opportunities. Missed birthdays, missed trust, missed the chance to see me as capable without question. I pressed the key fob, and the garage doors lifted automatically. The driveway emptied just enough for the car to roll forward. I glanced at the house one more time, noticing subtle details. The slight tilt of Linda's head, the cautious glance Richard gave to the street. Nothing was aggressive, only realization. Their loss was silent, internal, and it was visible in the restraint of their posture. The Porsche rolled smoothly down the street. I stopped briefly at the corner to watch the house from the car's vantage point. Leaning back in the seat, I smirked, just slightly. "Thanks for forgetting my birthday. Again," I murmured, not for amusement, but as acknowledgement of how far I had come, how stark the contrast was between their perception and reality. The humor was dark, pointed, an irony that cut through the months of tension. Traffic moved normally around me. The winter sun cast long shadows across the pavement, and I allowed myself a few breaths, steadying the calm that had been hard-won. The contracts in the drawer, the verified emails, the logs, everything was secure. Their tools of influence had no hold here. The network of subtle pressure, threats, and manipulation had been dismantled by evidence and careful planning. I checked the rearview mirror casually, catching a glimpse of the driveway one last time. Linda and Richard were still in the same place, unmoving, absorbing the finality of the situation. I didn't accelerate. I wanted them to process the emptiness left by the control they had lost. The lesson was implicit. No words were necessary. The calm, deliberate movement of the car and my presence behind the wheel was sufficient. Marcus's voice pinged in my mind, remembering his advice to observe and act methodically. I had done that. I had maintained composure, documented evidence, and established boundaries that couldn't be crossed. Their missteps, their assumptions, and their past dismissals were all now irrelevant in the context of the control I held. I started the engine fully, letting the low rumble resonate, and the car glided down the street. Every gear shift was smooth, precise, measured, an extension of the discipline I had maintained throughout this struggle. The contracts remained locked, a physical reminder that proof was now in my possession, and any further attempt to manipulate, alter, or question would be met with immediate documentation and counteraction. The apartment where I had begun rebuilding was a destination, not a retreat. New numbers, new accounts, new control points were waiting. Each step forward solidified my position, both financially and emotionally. Every choice was deliberate, a reaffirmation of independence. There would be no going back, no reliance on opinions or permissions that had been withheld or misused for years. I shifted in the seat, aligning the papers in the drawer one last time, making sure everything was orderly. The contracts and records were stacked neatly, ready to be accessed only by me, only when necessary. The house faded behind me in the rearview mirror, the driveway shrinking with every turn of the wheel. A faint light blinked on the dashboard as I turned onto a wider street. The engine cut with a soft click when I stopped at a red light. I leaned back slightly, hands resting on the wheel, feeling the tension ease, but recognizing the vigilance that remained. This wasn't about revenge. It was about establishing boundaries, enforcing them, and moving forward without interference. The Porsche slid into motion again as the light turned green. Shadows stretched across the asphalt as I accelerated gently into the city's streets. The freedom of control, the finality of action, was palpable. Each street I passed felt like territory reclaimed, every turn a step further into autonomy. I glanced toward the house one final time from the car's vantage point. Linda and Richard remained on the porch, expressions still, caught in the reality that they had lost authority. Their missed chances, their disbelief, their inability to trust me had culminated in this moment. I didn't speak, didn't glance back again after that. The engine hummed as the sun lowered behind the buildings. The street opened ahead. Each mile moved me further from the past, further from manipulation, further into a space of self-determination. The drawer remained locked, the evidence intact, and my path forward unencumbered. Word count, 800.